Corporate fraud works best in the shadows, behind corporate walls. How does the government bring these wrongdoers to justice? Whistleblowers. These are the stories of those who risk their careers to shine a light on allegations of fraud. Today on Fraud in America.
All right, welcome to today's episode of Fraud in America. We have, once again, Jackie DeMar. She's our favorite guest of all time, but due to popular demand, we have brought her back. If you want to watch an earlier episode with Jackie, the link below or the notes will take you right to the earlier interview. This one's going to be a short one, but there's some important updates that we wanted to share with you. Jackie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jackie, we are in an interesting point right now, right? The Supreme Court is considering a False Claims Act case of importance, right? And we have filed an amicus brief supporting one side, and we're waiting for the dark side to file their completely erroneous brief in a few days. Can you talk about that case and why that case matters so much?
Sure. So the case is U.S. X-Rail v. SuperValue, and it's actually two cases that were in the Seventh Circuit that are companion cases, one against Safeway and one against SuperValue. Those are pharmacies that were undercutting the other competitors in the market by price matching and cutting their prices on generic drugs to very low levels so that they could compete with some other pharmacies. Those pharmacies were reporting their proper drug prices to the government, so the government reimburses under Medicare and Medicaid based on the amount that that these pharmacies usually charge their customers. It's called a usual and customary price, and so that has to be reported to the government, so the government can properly reimburse the pharmacies for charging those prices. SuperValue and Safeway were not reporting their very low prices that they were charging to cash-paying customers, which means they were reporting inflated prices to the government, and the government was paying them back more than they should have because that was not actually their usual and customary price. So that's all kind of background facts that but the ruling on knowledge is the one that we have a problem with, and that can implicate all kinds of cases, not just these usual and customary pricing cases. So, what the court essentially held in the Seventh Circuit was that if regulation is ambiguous and a company has a reasonable interpretation of the regulation after the fact, even if they didn't hold that interpretation at the time that they made a false claim, they cannot be held to have the proper knowledge under the False Claims Act. And that's essentially, the False Claims Act has three different knowledge standards: deliberate ignorance, reckless disregard, and actual knowledge. And essentially what the court held was that actual knowledge is not relevant at all to determining whether a company can be held liable under the False Claims Act. And again, that is pretty crazy in a fraud case, that if you know you're committing fraud and you intend to commit fraud, it doesn't matter if your lawyer can come up with some interpretation of the regulation or contract term or whatever it is after the fact. So in theory, that has a very broad application, and so our brief basically, and the relator's brief, argues that subjective knowledge is always relevant to whether you're committing fraud or not. The government, the court also did a couple other things where they limited. So you have to have been warned away from your behavior if you're claiming that you have a reasonable interpretation. You have to have not been warned away from that interpretation. The court limited the kinds of guidance you can use to determine whether you were warned away or not. And that narrow kind of guidance has large implications for kind of how the government runs right now. There's lots of ways you can ask the government if your interpretation of a regulation is correct, that are not strictly fall within these categories. And that kind of throws all those ways to know if you're violating the law out the window. So it can potentially have a big impact on all kinds of cases.
You know, we both have children, right? School-age children, young children. I'm trying to picture my child coming to me, my daughter, and saying, yeah, I knew I was lying, but listen to this, like ambiguous interpretation that I came up with, Dad. So it really blows my mind that, sometimes as lawyers, we like to put a little too much jelly on the biscuit, right? The reality is it's just about law.
Exactly. And a court holding in a fraud case that you can know you're lying and intend to lie, and that doesn't matter because of your fancy lawyer later comes up with some ambiguousness to the regulation. That's crazy, right?
Yeah. Well, I hope for the sake of all parents that children aren't listening to this and saying that's an argument that we can get behind.
Yeah, I can see Helen doing that, honestly.
How do you think the court's going to come out on this?
Well, they're rational people, and they
Some
look
of them are parents.
Right, and the Supreme Court often really sticks to the text of the statute at issue, and the text of the statute at issue here has 3 knowledge standards, one of which is actual knowledge, and I don't see how they can write those other standards out of the knowledge standard under the False Claims Act. So I'm hoping that they see that this is just patently ridiculous on its face, and hold the right way. And I think, and the defense side is really arguing that, well, it's ambiguous. If it's ambiguous, you can't possibly have violated the regulation, but you can know that you're doing something wrong, and regardless of whether later you have decided that it's something you didn't know, it was ambiguous. I think the argument just falls flat on its face. I think it doesn't make any sense.
Well, Justice Jackie, I hope your fellow justices agree with you. We'll see how that comes out. We encourage everyone to read our amicus brief in this case, to read the government's brief in this case, to read the petitioner's brief. Skip over the respondent's brief on this one. Really an important case that has implications going forward. Senator Grassley has already said that if the court goes the wrong way on this, he may weigh in legislatively. We'll see how that plays out.
Yeah. And we usually don't want, False Claims Act cases necessarily going to the Supreme Court just in case there's a bad ruling and then that's the law of the land. But in this case, I think it's good either way. If it's a bad ruling, then that'll spur Senator Grassley hopefully to make some changes to the act. And then if it's a good ruling, then good.
Right.
Then we're good. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this ruling has caught a lot of people's attention on the Hill and beyond. That just common sense should play out here.
Right.
Sometimes that doesn't win the day at the Supreme Court, but we'll see how it plays out. So a lot of other stuff happening in our world right now, right? There's a lot of states that are passing or looking to pass False Claims Act. You testified recently to the Maryland Senate and the Maryland Assembly, encouraging them to expand their False Claims Act. Why is that important?
Well, the Maryland False Claims Act is actually unique in a whole bunch of ways, but one of the ways is that a qui tam whistleblower cannot take their case forward if the Attorney General declines to intervene. And that wipes out a ton of cases, especially now. Decline cases account for more than half of the federal dollars recovered last fiscal year, and increasingly relators are taking their qui tam cases forward on behalf of the government, and that's really what the qui tam statute is meant to do. It's meant to supplement the government's resources, allow whistleblowers to take their cases forward with their competent attorneys, and I think Maryland is really missing out on a whole bunch of recovered dollars based on this weird rule that they have. And so in other states, we're also trying to expand the State False Claims Act to include tax fraud, for instance, and just make general improvements to the laws, and we're having a lot of success right now. I think people, with COVID and all the spending and everything, I think it's really the government funding and fraud on the government has really captured people's attention, and I think that states are starting to get behind in strengthening their laws.
I saw that President Biden, in announcing his budget, highlighted fighting fraud as one of the big initiatives he's focusing in on. Seems to be the hot button issue right here.
And we'll hold him to it.
Yeah. So as we're recording this right now, the Wall Street Journal is talking about banks that have failed over the weekend, over the last few days. This feels a little bit like 2008 to me when I look at the Wall Street Journal. Taxpayers Against Fraud and everything that we're doing here is expanding into the financial fraud area to make sure that whistleblowers in the SEC, CFTC, the new FinFraud anti-money laundering program know that there's an avenue for them to expose fraud. Why do you feel like that's more important now more than ever?
Well, I think you're right that we're looking at a lot of with crypto and all these things that are just collapsing around us. Kind of the fraud on the financial markets is bigger than more than ever, I think, and so it's just really heartening to see that it's not just fraud on the government, it's fraud on us as investors and fraud on the financial markets. And people are taking it really seriously. Congress people are taking it seriously. I think it's become a real priority for the government to improve these programs and to encourage people to come forward. I think the SEC got something like 12,000 tips last year, which is really crazy, but I mean, that means we need a lot of people at the SEC to review all these things, and so they're getting more funding, and that's really great to see. And I think these programs are really coming into their own now, really starting to improve. I think more people know about them, and like what we can do is to just let everyone know, scream it from the rooftops that these programs exist, because a lot of people don't know. People don't even know the False Claims Act exists either. I mean, it's getting that knowledge out there that's really important. These whistleblower programs are very sophisticated now, and I think they're just going to improve over time.
So since we talked last time, we launched a new membership program, Financial Fraud Membership, to help guide financial fraud whistleblower attorneys through the process and help encourage them as they move forward. So these are people who are representing people in the SEC, the CFTC, and the FinCEN anti-money laundering program. Can you talk a little bit about that membership and the events that are coming up?
Sure. I'm really excited to launch this membership. So we have, I think, about 100 of our members have joined up to this financial frauds membership. And that is really, not everyone, there are some experts in our field, right? And they are actually included in this group and are going to be so useful to the rest of the members that don't have as much experience in these areas, because it's tricky. There's lots of little quirks with the programs, and you really have to know what you're doing to file a good claim. And so I think that we're going to use our experts to kind of educate the rest of the membership who are just kind of dabbling or just starting out. And we're also going to, really drill down on issues that are very important to those people, because they're not the same as the General False Claims Act. There's a whole bunch of different things, and they've kind of expressed that they feel like they're on an island even within their law firms because no one else does this work. And so bringing them all together to be able to discuss things, to drill down on little, important issues with each of the programs, I think is going to be really, really good for everyone. We have a conference coming up in May. That's going to be our first financial frauds conference, and I'm very, very excited about it. We're putting the agenda together now, and it'll be great to have everyone together. I'm super interested in hearing from everybody, because I don't know as much about the programs, these newer programs, as I would like to. So I'm really excited to learn from them as well, and to hear from people in the government and things like that about what's going on in these programs.
So $6 billion has already been recovered by the SEC whistleblower program. You talked about 12,000 tips coming in, educating our attorneys on how best to package evidence so that it makes for a strong submission to the SEC, so that it makes sure that they identify fraud that's actionable. So important right now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's all these different schemes that you don't even think about unless you know it, right? And so I think this is a good chance for us to look at these different schemes, be able to identify them, and figure out whether it is an actual fraud or not.
So Jackie is going to continue herding the cats, educating them about all these different areas. We're going to continue doing our job and educating you, the public, about all these different emerging fraud schemes that we're identifying and these important whistleblower programs. You're going to want to join us next time when we dive into a different area on the next episode of Fraud in America. Hope you enjoyed today's episode of Fraud in America. If you believe you have witnessed fraud against the government or fraud on the financial markets, we encourage you to visit our website at taf.org, where you will find a directory of member attorneys who represent whistleblowers across the country. On our website, you will also find additional information about our nation's various whistleblower laws and programs and a way to donate to our organization as we step forward in spreading information about whistleblower programs. This episode was edited and produced by Rachel Brooks, and our theme song is by Connor Chaos. A big thank you to our TAF staff and researchers of James King, Emma Bass, Jackie DeMar, Kate Scanlon, Max Boldman. Fraud in America is a project of Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund. The opinions expressed on today's show belong solely to the guest and are not necessarily endorsed by the organization. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Fraud in America.